I can only honestly say that I've touched on my childhood fear a couple of times in 5 years. And those times were so, when that prison came down just a little bit, was so terrifying, the fear, experiencing bodily that fear itself, that I haven't been willing to go there.
I agree.
Again.
Yeah, I agree.
So the question is the adult side of me that builds the prison is really very justified. You know, I justify it.
You do.
Because when I feel that childhood fear, it like, rationally I tell myself I get a little slice of it.
Yep.
Through it.
So really what you're saying is...
More fear. I'm terrified of that actual loss of control.
Yes, you're terrified of being overwhelmed.
I'm not sure what the question is. It's just that it's very scary.
It hasn't been a question yet. Can you ask one? So what are you asking, really? What's the thing you'd like to ask?
That my childhood, my adult self feels very justified to build that big brick wall and isolate myself.
I agree.
From what do you do with...
Well, can I ask you a question? What are you going to do about that?
Well,
because no change is possible without you doing something about it.
But that childhood feel is hideous.
Yep, I agree. Whenever a person's been abused as a child, there's going to be terrible feelings involved.
What do I want to do about it? Well, I could answer you and say I want to change it, but that's a lie.
That's correct. It is a lie at the moment. That's why things haven't changed. You see, this is what I see happening constantly. Things have happened to us, right? Some of the things that have happened to us weren't under our own control at the time, particularly if things happened to us when we were a child. Very damaging things happened to us when we were a child. They weren't under our control at the time. We had certain feelings associated with that as a child. But we are now an adult, right? We have control over what goes on in this system. This is our internal system. We have control of it. Your adult is going, I justify keeping this prison. Now, for as long as you justify keeping the prison, you will keep it. So you could stay in this state of keeping this prison, in a state of anger, really it is, if you think about it, and you're not even feeling it as anger yet. Right? You're not feeling how angry you are with God and with the universe and everything, that God is expecting you to actually go through these emotions, to actually go through and go. Of course, God's saying, I will help you go through everything, but you don't really believe that. You don't have faith in that. You believe it's all just going to have to be you alone. Right? And you have no faith that after you've gone through that you'll be free. You don't have any faith in that either. This is why you've established the prison. You see the prison not as a prison. You see it as your protective walls against the world. Right? And that's a great way of staying in a prison, you know. If you don't believe it's a prison anymore and you believe it's actually, you know, your fortress instead, of course there's a higher likelihood you'll stay in it. Right? So as the adult, you see this as your fortress and not your prison. So you're already seeing things in a flawed manner. It's your prison. It's controlling most of your life. It's controlling your relationships. It's controlling your soulmate relationship. It's controlling your relationship with God. It controls what's happening to your body even. Like in terms of physically what's happening with your body is all controlled by this. And you're unwilling to let it go because the adult's saying, the child is justified. I am justified holding on to this prison. I am justified having all these protective barriers up. I'm justified having all this fear. You know, it makes sense for me to have all this fear and keep it inside of me.
It just feels like that childhood fear it's bigger.
How can it be bigger, logically? How can it be bigger than you are yourself right now? It can't, logically, be bigger. It's an emotion that entered you as a child. As an adult, you now have the ability to release it. You now have the choice. And you are exercising your choice, your will. And by the way, you're not alone. The majority of people in the audience are exercising their will in their choice to maintain, in this adult state, anger about saying, that's where I want to be. I don't want to be any different to that. And the fact that God expects me to let go of stuff that I feel is too big for me to feel. And God's saying, no. Like with me, everything, God is saying to you, with me, everything's possible. You can feel anything with me. That's what God's saying. But you don't trust that yet. And because you don't trust that and have faith in that, you don't want to exercise your will in the direction of release. And because you don't exercise your will in the direction of release, you spend 5 years complaining about what's happened in your life in the past and not changing. And the only person who has the most pain from that is you. Like, can you see? It's like by not releasing, the only person who retains the pain is yourself. Of course, you impose this pain upon others, so you actually cause pain for others during that place as well. But the person in the largest amount of pain for not dealing with something inside of yourself is yourself. That's the reality. And the majority of us don't want to hear that. The majority of us want to hear, there's got to be another way. You feel at the moment that God should make some other way for you to become at one with God, other than you having to feel you.
I was just thinking that as you were talking. There has to be another way.
There has to be another way. And in fact, many of you have actually spent the last 5 years trying to find another way. More than you've spent trying to practice the basics to lead you this way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
You've spent most of your time trying to find an alternative. Of course, every alternative doesn't make any logical sense. It doesn't make any, it's not truthful. It's not emotional in its way, so it doesn't have any effect in the long run. And eventually you come around to think, yeah, maybe there is only one way. But when a person is told there is only one way to God initially, they go, no, that's not the case. There's got to be millions of ways to God. There's got to be infinite ways to God. And I'm saying, no, I'm sorry. There's only one way to God that God actually created. And that way is going to mean involving, experiencing yourself. And that means experiencing every single thing inside of you. That means that God created you with the capacity and ability to feel everything that's happened to you in the past, no matter how traumatic and how bad it's been.
When I'm in that childhood fear, I don't have that ability to trust.
See, I would suggest to you that when you're in the childhood fear truly, you will trust implicitly. You're not in the childhood fear yet. You've got the adult constantly monitoring how big the fear is getting, and in your case, it's terror that you need to experience, right? So you've got terror to experience, and the adult is maintaining the boundary. So the adult you is saying to the child you, if you like, you are only allowed to feel your terror until I get freaked out. And the child wants to let go of all of its terror, and the adult's saying, no, you can only let go of the terror till I get freaked out, the adult, till it's too much for me. So it's actually the adult that's got the problem, not the child. The child wants to let it all go. If you look at your own children, and any of you who've got children, you know that if you let your child cry, it will get to a point where it finishes. And a lot of times, if you control the child's crying, it goes longer than when the child would just let to cry by itself. That's the reality. Now, I've had 2 children. I know what I'm talking about when it comes to those kind of issues. What happens as an adult is we want to control the child not because of the child going through a bad experience, because often the child doesn't feel it is. It's because we are going to get triggered by the child's experience, and we try to shut down the child. The whole reason why most of the time we can't cope with a child crying is because we don't want to cry. The adult doesn't want to. Now, if you apply that to yourself, you will see that your child has lots of different emotions to feel, right? Some anger, terror, fear, grief, and the big one that many people avoid, shame. Right? The child has a lot of emotions it wants to feel, but the adult goes, you can only feel that in amongst the boundary I create for you. Because beyond that boundary, you're afraid of what? Going crazy. You're not? Going crazy. Always being there. What would you call that when you feel like you're going to always stay in a certain emotion? Like you have a false belief, for many of us, that if we start crying, we'll never finish. Does that make sense?
The fear of craziness is definite, and mental illness that I'm gonna.
Certainly.
The fear and.
But even bigger for you is your fear of your own shame.
Yeah.
You know, your father blamed you for his abuse of you, and you've now taken that on, and you now believe that you must have somehow asked for this abuse to occur, and the feeling of that shame is so great that you, adult you, wants to prevent it. Does that make sense? And so it creates a boundary. The adult you creates the boundaries, not the child. The child wants to feel. The child always wanted to feel. Right? It's only the adults around us, our parents initially, our environment, but then eventually ourselves. Right now it's ourselves, the majority of us, create the boundaries that allow what we will experience. And we are locked into that. And we're not willing to stretch that. We're not willing to go beyond the boundaries. We're afraid of being this terrible word, overwhelmed. We want to be whelmed, if there is such a word. In other words, we want there to be a limit to what happens. We don't want to go beyond what we believe is our own personal limit. Now, God created you without limits. God created you with the ability to expand your limitations, infinitely, in fact. That's what divine love, as it's received in the soul, transforms the soul in such a way as to making it become more infinite in its nature to experience and expand. That can only happen by this part, the overwhelming part. But we don't want to go there. The adult wants control. The adult wants to avoid the fear. The adult wants to have God as its fear. And the adult generally forgets that God is God and instead believes their fear is God. Right? And as a result, they place these boundaries on every emotion, and so you will only experience the emotion up until that point. The majority of you are facing this problem. The reason why we're stagnant in our progression, in our relationship with God, is because we are placing limitations upon the expressions of our emotions. That's what we're doing, constantly. And we're doing that because we believe we can't cope with anything more. We don't have any trust in God. We don't have any faith that God will be with us while we go through our emotional state, while we process through it all and come out the other side. A person who does that will never process through terror, will never process through fear, will never process through their own grief, will never process even through their anger. That's the limitation of doing it. You will never process through it to the point of completion. And this is one reason why many abuse survivors, for example, spend years and years and years and years going to psychotherapy and yet still never getting it all out of themselves. Right? I used to attend a meeting of what was called adult survivors of childhood abuse. And many times, and I went to those meetings for 5 years, right, myself. And what I found was this, that the story they told me when I arrived at the meeting was the same story they were telling people 5 years later who arrived at the meeting for the first time. In other words, for 5 years, they had been going to see psychotherapists, visiting this meeting, talking about their abuse, and yet still the abuse was as raw as it was the day that I met them. And how did that occur? That occurred because they had placed limitations on their experience. That's the addiction. And if we place limitations on our experience, we will never get to the bottom of anything. We'll never get to the bottom of anything. And while it's great for you, Jen, to see that that's the case, the real question is, how long do you want this to last? That's the real question. Because to be frank with you, there are people in the spirit world now who've been there for 1,000 years, and they've wanted it to last for 1,000 years. They are unwilling to face the abuse of their own childhood while they lived on earth from 1,000 years ago. It is just as raw today for them as it was 1,000 years ago when it occurred. Do you want that? Do you want to change that? Because the only way to change that is by changing this person's beliefs, not the child. The child will be fine. The child is going to be under God's wing, working way through every emotion. The adult is the problem. The adult's the one who wants to control the process. All right? And this is our problem, is that we're in this place, we're willing to throw away love, we're willing to throw away truth, we're willing to throw away humility, we're willing to throw away faith, we're willing to even throw away our own willpower just to maintain this structure, right, which does not bring us any happiness. It's going to keep us in the same place we are today, and in 10 years' time, 50 years' time, 100 years' time, 200 years' time, 1,000 years' time, unless we change, we will be that person for that time. And this is where it all gets down, doesn't it, to this really wonderful quality, this humility quality. Because without humility, change is not possible. Humility allows you to experience something beyond which you feel you're capable of experiencing, but which God knows you are fully capable of experiencing.